I will tell you something most women my age were taught never to say out loud. My son hurt me. He hurt me for 10 years, and I still made him breakfast the next morning. Do you think a mother can forgive everything? I used to think so. I used to tell myself a mother's love is a river that keeps moving even when the banks collapse. But the river I lived beside in Savannah taught me another lesson. Water remembers the shape of what breaks it. It keeps the memory in the current, and you can feel it when the tide turns, in that hush that comes just before the lift. If you stay with me until the end, I'll tell you why I forgave, and why forgiveness did not mean handing my life back to the person who took it. My name is May. The heat in Savannah is a polite kind of heat. It knocks and then lets itself in. When I was a girl, I would lie under the ceiling fan watching the blades turn like slow birds. Spanish moss draped the live oaks outside our window, and the marsh smelled like salt and sweet rot, the way life and old stories smell when you stir them. We lived in a small house painted the color of rainy pearls, and my mother kept lace at the windows, hand-starched until it could stand on its own. She believed in quiet as a kind of armor. "Baby," she'd say, pinning another hem beneath her needle, "a lady doesn't make a fuss. She endures." The word endure was a piece of bread she kept feeding me, even when I wasn't hungry. My father worked on the river, hauling crates down at the port, sometimes guiding tourists to look at the ships that lifted up like apartment buildings on the water. He whistled when he walked, and he could tell the weather by how the gulls circled. He smelled of rope, soap, and the weak peppermint he kept in his shirt pocket for me. On Sundays, we'd go to Forsyth Park to see the fountain spray like a bride's veil. I liked the shade of that place, the cool on my neck, the slow way people moved, as if walking inside a dream they didn't want to wake from. I learned the soft skills early, the ones that don't look like skills until you need them: how to make tea whisper to a sore throat, how to count the minutes between thunder and lightning, how to read a man's mood by the sound of his shoes in the hall. I learned to remember birthdays and forget insults. I learned to stack laughter on top of worry like dishes, so you only see the clean plate on top. Is that love? Or is it how women disappear in plain sight? I married at 19 to a man named Harold who had hands like bookends, big and steady. He worked at a small garage off Victory Drive, and he looked at me like kindness was a promise he could keep. We had 2 boys, first Jonah and then the one this story belongs to more than I wish it did, my Matthew. When Matthew was born, the nurse said he had an old soul. He stared like he could see history walking across the room. He was beautiful. That is what makes this difficult to say without apologizing. He was beautiful, and he became dangerous. Back then we lived in a house with floors that sang when you crossed them. I kept Jasmine by the doorstep and a quilt my grandmother made folded at the foot of our bed, the kind with tiny stitches that taught you patience every time you looked. We were not rich, but we had decency, which is a kind of wealth that looks small until you start to lose it. The boys ran around with river mud on their shoes, and we ate on the porch with the fan pushing the air just enough to pretend it was cool. I salted watermelon the way my mother taught me. I taught my sons to say grace and to help Mrs. Warren across the street carry her groceries when the heat turned her hands into trembling birds. Jonah was a born peacemaker, the sort of child who would put his toys between fighting cousins to make a wall you couldn't cross without smiling. Matthew was sharper. He loved puzzles and disliked being told to slow down. He wanted to know how everything worked under the lid. Once, he took apart the kitchen radio and put it back together just to prove he could. I called him my tinkerer. He called himself an engineer and wrote it in crayons on the cover of his spelling book. When he said, "Mama, I'm not like other people," I thought he meant he was going somewhere. I didn't know, not yet, that sometimes not like other people is a storm coming in with a blue sky still lying to you overhead. Harold died when the boys were in high school, a sudden thing, the kind that steals words from the room and doesn't give them back. In the weeks that followed, time slowed and then sped up the way grief does, like a record you play with a wrong hand. People came by with casseroles that tasted like the same sorrow in different pans. I folded his shirts for the last time and kept one at the back of the closet because the smell of him was the only prayer I knew. Jonah grieved quietly, the way decent men do when they're young and afraid their sadness will scare their mothers. Matthew grieved loudly, and then not at all, and then in ways that broke other things. He started staying out late, then not coming home, then coming home at strange hours with a hum under his skin, like electricity with nowhere to go. He brought new friends whose eyes slid around the room looking for exits. He said college was a joke, that he was smarter than his teachers, that men got rich by making noise, not by saying please. He began to borrow money and forget to pay it back. I told myself it was a phase, like acne or those moods that hang on boys like wet shirts after rain. I told myself all mothers worry too much. Is denial a flavor of love? If it is, it tastes like sweet tea left too long on the stove, a little burned at the bottom and still something you raise to your lips. The first time he scared me, he didn't touch me. He shut the car door so hard the glass trembled and looked at me with a face I didn't know. Anger can take a person's features and rearrange them until you recognize only the outline. He said I was nagging. He said I was disrespectful. He said he was a man now and didn't need a mother telling him how to breathe. I didn't say, "You are my child." I said, "I'm sorry." I have said I'm sorry for things that weren't my fault more times than I have said my own name. If any of this sounds like a life you've brushed past or lived, I want you to tell me in the comments what you wish someone had told you then. Your words might be the bridge someone else needs tonight. And if you carry a quiet story that aches to be seen, you can stay here with me. We make a small room for honest voices. If you want to hear more stories like mine, you can follow along, but only if it feels like kindness to yourself. The first shove was small. Not the act, the place it happened, by the sink, with the kettle singing and my hand on the burner dial. He reached past me. I said, "Careful, baby." He said, "Don't call me baby," and used his shoulder to move me out of the way. I stepped wrong and hit the counter, and the sound of the kettle covered everything. Later, when I touched the bruise forming, I told myself kitchens are full of accidents. The price of silence is paid in tiny excuses, and it adds up like coins you pretend not to count. There were good days. That is the trap most people don't want to hear about. There were days he brought me flowers from a grocery store bucket and kissed the top of my head like he was the one taking care of me. He fixed the screen door, mowed the yard, sat with me on the porch and said, "Mama, remember when we used to go down to the river and throw sticks and see which one won?" And because the river knows how to charm you even as it cuts new channels, I said yes, and nostalgia did what it does, it made a path back to a time that wasn't dangerous. Then, on a different day, the house would bend itself around his temper. This is how it worked, and I am not the first woman to learn the brittle math of it. There is always a reason in his mouth. Money. Work. The traffic. The world that refuses to recognize him. What I said. What I didn't say. The look on my face. The fact that a bird touched the power lines and the lights blinked. Anything can be a match in the wrong room. But he always had an apology too, and it sounded like redemption. "I'm sorry, Mama. I just get spun up. You know me. You know I love you." And because I knew that boy who took radios apart and put them back together again, I believed he could put us back together too. People ask why women don't leave. They ask it with the breathless entitlement of those who have never had to stash emergency cash beneath the sugar canister. They ask it as if love had an off switch you could flick the way you snap off a light when you leave a room. I didn't leave because leaving means admitting the world you built was paper. It means telling your church ladies your son, the one whose baby pictures you showed with your chin lifted like pride was a fixed star, is the reason you wear long sleeves in August. It means sitting at a lawyer's desk with the air conditioner blowing too cold and explaining where each bruise came from while you can't keep your hands from smoothing your skirt, as if neatness were a defense in court. And then there's the fear. Fear is heavy, but it's also etiquette. It teaches you not to make scenes. I learned to move without scraping the chair legs. I learned to speak like I was placing delicate china in a quiet cabinet. I learned to tell the doctor I tripped, and to joke with the cashier when I bought a shade of makeup called Honey Umber to cover yellowing that wasn't a sun story. I learned to keep the blinds angled just so. I learned to pray without asking for miracles, only for the strength to keep one piece of myself untouched, a small seed of something that could germinate when a different season came. The night things broke in a way I couldn't patch, the air held a storm. If you are from here, you know that feeling, the way the marsh goes still and the birds change their grammar. He came in loud. The front door complained. His shoes hit the hall like declarations. He wanted money he said I owed him. He wanted gratitude for what he did yesterday. He wanted proof I didn't throw away the receipt for the thing he needed to return. Want, like the tide insisting on touching every piece of shore at once. I said something soft because softness is how I survived. He took it as refusal. He threw the keys, and they clanged against the sink and fell into the kettle's water with a sound like a bell gone wrong. I don't know why that sound made me pick up the phone. Maybe because it was holy and ugly at once, a church bell for a church I hadn't entered yet. I dialed, and the room changed shape. He saw what I was doing and his mouth opened in a way I won't describe, because there are faces you don't need to share. He grabbed my wrist. I said his name. Sometimes a name is a leash, sometimes it is a lullaby. That night, it was only letters. The call went through. I said my address, the way they teach you to do in elementary school for fires and tornadoes. He let go. He left. I stayed very still and watched a small bubble rise in the kettle where the keys had sunk, like even metal was trying to breathe. And then there were footsteps on the porch that did not belong to my son. The officer was young enough to be my grandson. He spoke like someone walking on gravel, carefully. He asked if I needed an ambulance. I said no. He asked if I was safe. I said I didn't know. He gave me a card, and behind the card was a world I had refused to imagine, a shelter I didn't have to sleep in to accept help from, a counselor who specialized in women whose stories had become traffic circles, a support group at a church that wasn't mine because I had too much pride to cry in front of ladies who knew my pound cake recipe. He didn't tell me what to do. He told me what existed. Sometimes that is all a person needs to step off one life and onto another. If you're still listening, and if your heart is making a sound you don't quite recognize, you can pause and breathe with me. If you know someone who might need these words, share them. And if you want a space where we honor the quiet but tell the truth, you can subscribe so you'll know when voices like mine come knocking again. I did not leave that night. I wish I could tell you I packed a bag while the storm banged its fist on the water and a saxophone on a distant square played Mercy. What I did was take the kettle off the stove and fish the keys out with a wooden spoon. I cleaned the stove because it calms me. I wrapped a scarf around my wrist so the bruise would look like fashion. I slept badly and woke to cicadas insisting the world keeps going. The officer's card sat on the counter like an invitation I wasn't sure I deserved. The next morning, I called. The woman on the other end had a voice like a porch at dusk. She said my name the way kindergarten teachers say names, with hope for who you might be by springtime. She told me there were steps. Not a staircase, just steps, little enough that you can take one even if you're tired enough to sit on the floor halfway to the bedroom. She said there were papers we could file that would tell the law to build a circle around me, a protective order. She said there were people who would sit with me while I told the truth so I didn't have to keep my eyes on my hands the entire time. I didn't say yes right away. The habit of no is a hard one to put down. But I went to see her. The church basement smelled like coffee and lemon cleaner. The chairs were metal and honest about it. Women sat in them with faces that felt like mirrors if I dared to look. One wore a cap to hide where someone had grabbed her hair. I looked at her cap instead of her eyes, because sometimes love is looking where a person wants you to look. One kept glancing at her phone as if apologies could come in texts if she just watched long enough. One had a laugh that surprised itself. We went around the room saying our names and not saying the names of the men who had taught us our silence. When it came my turn, I said, I am May. I am tired, and they nodded like I had finally spoken a language we all shared. It took weeks to file the papers because I am from a generation that files recipes, not complaints. The courthouse air was too cold, and the fluorescent lights made me feel like I was being peeled. A volunteer named Sandra sat beside me and made small good jokes about pens that don't write when you need them most. She did not push me. She did not tell me what to remember. She only guarded the space while I waited for my courage to gather itself into a single line of ink. When the judge read the order, the words sounded harsh and clean as rain against a tin roof. Matthew was not to come within so many feet of me, not to call, not to stand on my porch and make my name into a weapon. The first night after the order, the house made new noises. I thought every sound was him. The ice maker became footsteps. The cat next door was a threat practicing its vowels. I sat up with a cup of tea I did not drink and watched the blinds cut the moon into strips. Dawn came like a truce. I made toast, buttered it to the edges the way Harold liked it, and realized I had buttered it for myself the same way for decades without noticing. Isn't it strange what we inherit from the kindness we gave away? When he called from a blocked number and I answered without thinking, his voice came as if it had been moving toward me the whole time. He cried. He apologized. He said he was sick. He said he loved me. He said a mother should never do this to a son. He asked me how I could sleep at night knowing what I had done to him. I did not hang up. I wish I could tell you I did. I listened until my ear was hot against the phone and my heart felt like a small animal trying to make itself big. I told him the order existed. He told me papers don't change blood. He hung up before I could decide my next breath, and I stood in the kitchen with the phone in my hand and the tea gone cold again and said the words the counselor had given me, "You are allowed to keep yourself." I said it out loud. It sounded like a key finding the right door. I started going to the group every Thursday. We took turns telling the truth in pieces small enough to hold. I learned that shame dissolves when you leave it on a table among women who pass the box of tissues like an offering plate. We didn't perform our hurt, we named it and let it sit without cleaning it up. The counselor asked, "What did you do to survive?" Not what did you do to make it worse. Not why didn't you leave. What did you do that got you here, still breathing? I said I counted. I counted heartbeats and I counted spoons. I counted days until Sunday when I could sit at the back of the church and let the hymns climb over me like ivy. I counted the number of words I could say before his eye changed. I counted the steps from the stove to the sink to the drawer where I kept the phone's charger to the back door. I counted and I kept a part of me from dying. She nodded and wrote, "Survival strategy, counting." Suddenly, the way I had lived was not a failure, it was a plan. I also went to therapy, the kind where a gentle person asks questions the way a gardener asks a plant what it needs. My therapist was a woman named Dr. Lang, small and precise, with hands that looked like they knew how to set a teacup down without a sound. She asked about my mother. I told her about the lace and the word endure. I told her about the ways my mother's mouth had closed around the secrets of our street like a drawstring bag. Do you think our mothers teach us to be safe, or to be loved? What if they believed those were the same lesson? I cried the way old boards creak when the weather changes. She taught me to breathe in a square, in, hold, out, hold. She taught me to ground myself by naming 5 things I could see, 4 I could feel, 3 I could hear, 2 I could smell, 1 I could taste. It felt silly until it worked, which is how many good things feel at first. I began making small changes inside my house, the only landscape I could fully edit. I put the kettle in a new place. I moved the knives to a drawer that didn't stick. I bought heavier curtains not because he would look in, I had the order, but because I wanted to practice the feeling of choosing who could see me. I changed the ringtone for unknown numbers to silence. I wrote little notes and stuck them inside bowls and shoes and under the sugar, "May, you are allowed." May, you are a person, not a porch. May, kindness is not the same as surrender. When I found them later, I smiled like a conspirator and put the kettle on for the third time that day. It took stubbornness to keep the order in place when family started to whisper. Family is a choir with no conductor. Some cousins said he needed treatment, not punishment, as if an order were a cell. Some said I was dramatic. Some said they didn't want to take sides. I told them there were no sides, only a line, and I was standing on mine. I told them they could love him from over there while I loved him from over here. I told them I could love him and refuse him access to my skin. They did not understand. That was not my job. What changed me most was not the paperwork or the talking, though both were hands on my back. It was the day I sat by the river alone. The light was the color of cold honey, and the water moved like it had known every woman like me who ever stood on that bank thinking about thresholds. A small wind lifted the moss so it looked like old ladies dancing, and I laughed out loud because even the trees were on my side for once. I thought about forgiveness then, not as a gift you give the person who harmed you, but as a gift you give yourself so you can stop wearing the day like a heavy coat in July. Forgiveness was a door that opened away from him. Justice was the hinge. I bought a second-hand bicycle with a basket and pedaled badly through quiet streets that smelled like gardenias warming their hands in the sun. My knees complained, but everything else cheered. I volunteered at the library to shelve returns, which is holy work if you've lived a life where you weren't allowed to put things where they belong. A child asked me how to spell forgiveness. I told her, sounding out the pieces, pressing each letter into the air like a seed into soil. I joined a small group of women who knit blankets for the neonatal unit. Sometimes healing is putting soft things in the hands of people who just arrived. Sometimes healing is letting your own hands learn softness again. And then one afternoon, I turned from the produce section where peaches were pretending to be sons, and there he was. Matthew. Leaner, jumpier, his eyes looking like they hadn't slept inside their sockets for a while. He froze. I did too. The grocery store became a stage, and the only noise was the refrigeration unit humming like an old hymn under everything. He said, "Mama," as if the word could fix architecture. I said, "Matthew," as if names were nets. He stepped toward me, then saw the order in my posture. It's a trick I learned, how to stand like a sentence that ends with a period you choose. He stopped. He opened and closed his mouth like he was trying to find the script he used to know. "I'm getting help," he said. "I'm in a program." He told me the name, a place I had heard of that taught men to put humility back into their hands. He said he wanted to make amends. I could feel every part of me dividing and then voting. The mother who kept the photo albums, the woman who had hidden makeup shades in her purse, the girl who had been fed the word endure, the patient I had become who breathed in squares. I said, "I am glad you are getting help." I said, "I hope you keep going." He reached as if to touch my arm. I stepped back. "We can talk," I said, "when your counselor sits between us and the daylight is strong." He looked like I had drained him. Then he nodded. He said he would ask his counselor to call mine. He said, "I love you." I said, "I love you from here," and walked to the register like I had just learned to walk. After that, there were supervised conversations in a room with chairs that had seen worse and better times. The counselor used words like boundaries and accountability, and I used them too until they tasted like my own. He told the truth sometimes, and sometimes he told stories the way men do when they're still trying to arrange facts so they don't have to live inside them. I did not correct him. I corrected myself when I wanted to fix his face. We met 3 times. Each time, I left with a small ache and a large relief, like a thorn had been a splinter all along. I want to say something now that might be hard. Love is not a receipt you can show at the returns desk. I loved him. I love him. But love did not obligate me to be his practice ground for pain. Mothers are not saints unless they are dead, and I am very alive, which means I get to decide what shape my days take. If you are listening and a part of you is asking permission, let me lend you mine. You are allowed to shape your days. If you want to keep sitting with me, this place can be yours too. You can subscribe so we don't lose each other in the noise. No rush. We'll be here, telling the truth softly enough to hear ourselves. Months passed like careful travelers. There were setbacks. He left the program once and went back. He got a job at a warehouse and then lost it when a fight broke out, and he forgot the order that a judge had built around me was also an order he needed to build inside himself. He called from a number that flashed his name and I blocked it because safety is not cruelty, it is stewardship. He sent a letter. I read it with Dr. Lang. It had more begging than responsibility in it, but at the end, there was a sentence that did not sound like theater. I am trying to learn how to be a person who does not hurt people. I folded the letter and put it in a drawer with the notes I wrote to myself. Another day, I took it out and tore it into strips and fed it to the trash. Letting go is also a kind of keeping space for what deserves to live. I built a small life with great care. I began to cook for pleasure again, not just service. I learned a recipe for lemon bars from a woman at the library who wore a pin shaped like a book. I ate them too soon and burned my mouth and laughed at myself with a mouthful of sugar and pain. I bought linen pants because the summers had grown more arrogant and I wanted fabric that forgave sweat. I sat on my porch and smiled at strangers, not because I owed the world a smile, but because I had extra that day and could afford to give some away. I met a man named Ellis at the market where small farmers pretended to be less tired than they were. He had hands like pencil sketches and eyes that took their time because he had nothing to prove. He asked me which tomatoes to choose if you want them to taste like a July you'll remember in January. He had lost a wife years back to an illness that had no manners. He loved birds the way some people love sports teams. He could identify them by how they say hello. We walked together sometimes, the kind of walking where you stop often because everything seems worth noticing when you are learning how not to hurry. He never asked about the order. I told him anyway one evening when the sky pressed rose lipstick to the edges of the clouds. He listened without fixing. When I finished, he said, "You kept yourself." It was the nicest thing any man had ever said to me. But stories like mine don't slide toward peace without one last stealing of breath. The call came from a hospital with a name that was supposed to sound safe. He had been admitted, something about a relapse and a fall and a head that met a floor. They listed facts like the ingredients of a terrible soup. They asked if I was his emergency contact. My body answered before my mouth did, because motherhood is not a job you can clock out of even when you've shut the diner down. I went. The hospital smelled like lemon and fear. The hallways held the day in their white fists. I found his room. He was asleep with his mouth open slightly, the way babies sleep when they have been crying. He looked like my boy, not the storm. That is the cruelty and the mercy. Abusers do not wear a mask full time. Sometimes they put on the face that makes you forget there are other faces. I sat. I watched his chest rise. I remembered the way the sun used to catch the top of his ear when he sat on the porch steps eating a popsicle. I remembered the apology that came too late and the hands that got there too soon and 1,000 small moments that add up to a life you barely recognize until you say it out loud to a stranger. When he woke, he saw me and began to cry like the first sound he ever made in the world. He said, "I'm sorry, Mama," and I believed him for the length of one inhale. Then I remembered that sorry is a leaf, it can be part of a tree, or just something blown across your path by weather. I took his hand, the way a nurse takes a hand, professionally kind. I said, "I forgive you." He cried harder. I said, "I forgive you for me." His face changed. He nodded as if a truth had finally arrived at the right station. He asked if he could come home when they released him. I said, "No." He asked why, his voice small as if we were practicing for a school play. I said, "Because forgiveness is not an invitation. It is a boundary wrapped in love." He turned his face away. I stood, kissed his forehead the way you bless a child leaving for the first day of school, and left, my legs shaking in the elevator while a woman held a bouquet that tried too hard to be cheerful. When I got home, I made the mistake of reading the comments on a story about a woman who had kept her order against a son who said he was doing better. People are not kind when they have keyboards between them and the person they're judging. But one comment stayed like a good stone in my pocket: broken people can love you, but they can still be dangerous. It is not unloving to lock the door. I thought about locks and keys and kettles and the shape of safety. I slept and dreamed of a river that used to frighten me and now felt like a teacher with chalky hands. If somewhere in this you hear your own steps, I want you to leave a small note down below. What keeps you steady when the house remembers the old noises? Your comment may land in the lap of someone who needs it. And if you've found this corner of the internet where old women tell fierce truths softly, you can subscribe to keep it alive. Not for numbers. For us. Healing is not a straight road. It is a neighborhood with cul-de-sacs and a bakery that smells like regret one day and cinnamon the next. There were days I could feel forgiveness slick as river light, and days I smelled the old fear on my skin when I had done nothing but sit still. Dr. Lang said trauma lives in the body like a song you've heard 1,000 times. You hum it by accident while you think you're listening to something else. She taught me to hum a new song. The new song had slow notes: a cup of tea held while still too hot to drink, a walk to the mailbox with bare feet because the ground was finally just warm enough, the way a grandchild's hand feels when it trusts you to cross the street. I practiced. I failed. I tried again. My granddaughter, Ruthie, was the one who taught me the holy trick of play. She had freckles like constellations and a laugh that could make a grocery store cashier forget she had been standing for 6 hours. We baked brownies and made an unforgivable mess. We drew birds that looked like something from another planet and named them politely. Ruthie asked where her uncle was. I told her he was trying to learn how to be kind to himself and other people, that sometimes grown-ups have to go to school for their hearts. She accepted this because children are merciful until we teach them not to be. One evening in late fall, the light did that thing where it turns everything it touches gold to remind you life has been kind more often than it has not, even if you don't believe it that day. The doorbell rang. Ellis stood there with a bag of oranges because he'd found a farmer who swore these were the kind that taste like the ones from his childhood, which is a promise you should never believe and always try anyway. He saw something in my face and asked with his eyes. I told him I had seen Matthew's counselor. Matthew wanted one more supervised conversation, to say words he didn't know how to live yet. I said yes. Ellis nodded and squeezed my hand with 2 fingers like a good luck charm you can keep in your pocket. At the center, Matthew sat like a man who was trying to remember how to sit. His counselor, a woman with a braid like a rope, smiled at me without asking me to do more than my share. He apologized again, the way the season apologizes for being itself, predictable and insufficient. He told a story about childhood that made him the hero and me the villain, and I did not argue because arguing steals time from the person you actually are. I said my truth: I loved you. I love you. I won't be hurt by you again. He asked me what forgiveness meant if it wasn't letting him back into my kitchen to drink coffee while I buttered toast to the edges. I told him forgiveness was releasing my need to make him understand. Forgiveness was returning his story to him with his name on it, not mine. Forgiveness was closing my eyes at night without rehearsing the sounds of his approach. Forgiveness was refusing to be a victim again. His counselor nodded like a metronome. He looked angry, then small, then something I couldn't name because naming is power, and I was practicing laying mine down when it wasn't my job to hold it. The last time I saw him, he was walking down a street I used to take to get to school. It was spring. Azaleas did their annual scandal. He didn't see me. I watched him pass and felt a door shut gently but firmly inside me. Not a slam. A decision. I went home and opened all the windows because the air had cleaned itself. I took the kettle off the stove, wrapped it in brown paper, and put it at the back of the highest shelf, not because kettles are dangerous but because some objects are museum exhibits from a life you choose not to visit anymore. I bought a new kettle. Blue. Light as a bird. It sings like mercy. I wish I could tell you he got well and stayed well, and we sat on my porch laughing like an old movie where everything resolves by the third reel. I wish I could tell you something easy. What I can tell you is I have peace most days. I can tell you I have not hidden a bruise in years. I can tell you I have learned how to make happiness in small batches, like jam, and put it by for lean days. I can tell you I go to bed because I am sleepy, not because the house has exhausted me. I can tell you I see the river and do not think of drowning. I think of the generous way it keeps changing its mind and still remembers what it is. If you're still with me, thank you. If this story put a hand on your back, put a small hand on someone else's back in the comments. Tell me how you learned to breathe again. And if you want to keep hearing voices like mine, you know the way to make sure this little porch light stays on. Some people think closure is a ceremony, a single day when the doors all line up like soldiers and you walk through and the past salutes and leaves you alone. For me, closure is quieter. It is saying no without the word trembling. It is buying a dress because you like the way it makes your neck feel, not because anyone will see you in it. It is sitting with a cup of coffee and letting it go cold because the birds are having an argument in the oak tree and you want to hear who wins. It is deciding the blue kettle will whistle whether or not you pick it up right away. It is letting the order expire and renewing it because peace is not something I gamble with, even when I am feeling brave. I look back and I am not proud of my silence, but I refuse to be ashamed of the ways I survived. Shame is a thief that likes to dress as humility. I will not open the door to it. I remember my mother's endure, and I think of all the women who swallowed that word for decades until it made their throats sore. I wish someone had given her a different word. I wish I had learned earlier that leaving is not failing, it is writing in a different tense. But I also honor the girl I was, the young woman, the wife, the mother, the woman on the phone with the officer, the patient in the fluorescent light, the knitter, the librarian, the friend, the porch sitter, the woman buying oranges. We are so many selves inside one skin. How can anyone judge a life without knowing the choreography of all those selves? Sometimes forgiveness feels like a pew in an empty church, quiet, wooden, honest. Sometimes it feels like a tide pulling you past what you thought you'd never get beyond. Sometimes it feels like making lemon bars and eating the first square too soon and smiling while it burns. Sometimes it feels like standing at your sink buttering toast for yourself and thinking of how many times you buttered it for other people and thanking yourself because you are finally on the list. Forgiveness is not a pardon and it is not a contract. It is a practice. Like breathing. Like setting the kettle on the right burner. Like checking the locks without apology and then sleeping anyway. On Sundays, I still go to Forsyth Park. The fountain sprays its veil, and newly married couples take photos as if they are inventing joy. I sit on a bench and watch older men argue about baseball with the seriousness of philosophers who have tasted loss and found rules in it. Children chase pigeons who refuse to be impressed. A girl plays a violin with a fierceness that makes the trees lean in. The moss bows and shivers and does its slow dance of survival. I let the sun rest on my hands. I breathe the easy breath of someone who knows the difference between danger and weather. Do you think a mother can forgive everything? I don't. Not everything. But she can forgive enough to free herself. She can forgive enough to say, I love you from here, and mean it. She can forgive enough to refuse to do the abuser's work for him by punishing herself forever. She can place a blue kettle on a stove in a clean kitchen and wait for it to sing. She can stand at a window and look at the river and say, I remember, and I choose. She can turn to the people who stayed and say thank you. She can turn to the people who will listen and say, you are allowed to keep yourself. She can turn to you, right now, and say, if you are in the dark, come sit with me a while. The light is not loud, but it is steady. We will breathe together until you remember your own lungs. If my story touched you, and you have the space, tell us about a time you chose peace over the old habit. If you want to help me keep this small circle warm for the next person who wanders in, you can subscribe. Not because I asked, but because you want a place where truth is told softly and fiercely at once. I will be here, on my porch in Savannah, listening to the slow birds of the ceiling fan and the regular miracle of the kettle, and I will be thinking of you, somewhere under your own sky, practicing the kind of forgiveness that does not hand your life away again. The river moves. The light changes. We remain.